Hopefully I can
because you have nothing to do, really.
Right.
So much free time. Okay, let's go on. Today, we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah briefly in the sermon. Okay, and that's a story that's often picked out when heterosexual community wants to justify their disdain for the gay community.
Yes.
So for the YouTube audience, I know that everybody here is well adept to the fact, but briefly go through an overview of what Sodom and Gomorrah talks about.
Well, I think if you want to understand the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, much like many stories in scriptures, you actually have to read it in context, and that it would be very wise for people to read Genesis 17 through 20, actually, to get the gist of what's going on. But essentially, Abram, his name has not yet been changed to Abraham, is living in the desert with his wife Sarah when they are visited by 3 angels, and Abram runs out to greet them because of the hospitality code, which is very, very important because there are no Motel 6s or anything like that. So if you don't greet people in the desert, they will literally die. He brings the guests in to take care of them. It's actually Sarah who takes care of them, but as I say, that's another sermon.
There's always another sermon.
But in the course of their discussion, he learns that they're on their way to visit Sodom and Gomorrah because God has sent them to check out reports of wickedness. And Abram becomes very concerned because his nephew Lot lives there and he doesn't want Lot to suffer any bad things. So he begins negotiating with these people who are angels in disguise. And he says, if there are 100 good people there, would God destroy the city? And they say, okay, if there's 100 good people, God won't destroy the city. And he just keeps going until he gets down to 10. And finally they've had enough and they say, okay, 10, but we're going. So they go and they wait in the town square when they get there for someone again to take them in. And no one does. Finally, Lot comes to the city square to take them in. And with that taking in comes the promise of security for the night. The townspeople hear that they're there, and so they go and knock on the door because this is actually a threat to the security of the town to take strangers in. And they say, this is the famous verse, Genesis 19:5, send them out to us that we may know them, yada them. And as we were talking about today in church, that word is actually used 943 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It means to know, but it means to know with your whole self, not just with your head. And in some cases, it has a sexual connotation, as in Genesis where it says, Adam yada Eve, and she bore Cain. And it may have a sexual connotation in this story because what happens is that Lot offers to send his virgin daughters out to these townsmen as opposed to the male disguised guests. And the angels intercede at that point and say that's not going to happen. And they blind the townspeople and tell Lot and his family to flee to the mountains. Lot's daughters' prospective husbands will not go, so they're left behind to the destruction. There's this odd story of Lot's wife turning around and looking and turning to salt, which I've never found a good explanation for. Lot and his daughters end up in the mountains where they have sex with their father to produce tribes, to continue the tribes. On the basis of that story, homosexuality is condemned, but clearly there's nothing homosexual going on in that story. Trying to rape someone or insinuate rape has nothing to do with homosexuality. And in fact, scholars say the parallel story is in Judges 19, where the same kind of thing happens, but in this case, the homeowner sends out his guest's concubine. He actually sends her out. And they rape her through the night, and she dies on his doorstep. And in the morning, they cut her body up into 12 pieces and mail it to the 12 tribes of Israel, saying, this is how Israelites are treating other Israelites. And I maintain, on the basis of that story, no one condemns heterosexuality. We condemn rape, which is what we should condemn on the basis of Genesis 19. It's also important to realize that Scripture comments on itself. It comments on Sodom and Gomorrah. So in Ezekiel, for example, Ezekiel will say that the sins of Sodom were gluttony and the rich not caring for the poor, but it never mentions anything about homosexuality. And Jesus himself, in Matthew's gospel, when he's sending out the disciples, says to them, it will go worse for those who didn't receive you than for Sodom and Gomorrah, clearly understanding that the issue at stake was how we receive one another, how we treat one another, the way we protect